Hello fellow cinephiles, 90s Film Guru here. Thanks for joining me today. Today I've decided to do something a little bit different. There's a particular film that is outside of the sort of films I usually really talk about or review on this channel because it's not in the 90s. It's a film that came out in 1985. And it's a film that I really loved watching it. I thought it was such a wonderful and interesting film, and there was a lot of elements that connected to another film I really liked from the early 90s, and I kind of like what this film had to say in a lot of ways. So today I'll be reviewing The Legend of Billie Jean, and I'll be connecting that to another film that feels like it was very inspired by this. The plot's different and the storylines are different, but they sort of connect in a way just because of the character, and the character is a voice for that particular generation or its generation. And I just think it's a really good connecting tissue, and that's Pump Up the Volume. I think these two films go hand in hand, and I found this was a way I could really talk about this film from 1985 and connect it to the sort of reviews I do on this particular channel and the movies that I review. This is a film I've heard a lot about over the years, and it's a film I've been really trying to see, but it's been very hard to find until it randomly popped up on Amazon Prime for $5. I just thought I would check it out because it's a film that I've been really intrigued by, because every time you look up a film in regards to teenage rebellion or going against the system, this is a film that always seems to appear. Directed by Matthew Robbins and starred Helen Slater, Christian Slater, Peter Coyote, and among others. And it also had Keith Gordon, who's mostly known for John Carpenter's Christine, and this was a film that he did many years later. And it's also produced by Rob Cohen, who would go on to direct himself. The film really follows Billie Jean, played by Helen Slater. This character sort of lives in this trailer park, and it sort of lives in this small town, and has a real connection, strong bond with her brother. And we see that in the beginning of the film, where these two go on this sort of jump on his bike and they head off down to the local gas station to go down to the lake to go swimming because it's really hot. And upon arriving at the gas station, they're harassed and picked on by the town bully, I guess, in a way, who has a real thing for Billie Jean but doesn't know how to interact with her, and only just picks on her and her brother. Ultimately, when her brother does something, his bike is stolen by this particular bully, and he ultimately is beaten to a pulp to try and retrieve his bike. This is when Billie Jean decides to take a stand and do what's right, and goes to confront the bully at his father's shop. And in this particular sequence, she stands her ground. All she wants is the money that is needed to fix the bike that he destroyed, and that's all she's after. But things slowly start to escalate in this scene, particularly when his father appears. And to begin with, he seems like a guy who just wants to do the right thing and help her out, and to give her what she's owed. But quickly we realise that this man isn't quite what he seems, and he really wants sexual favours in return for giving her some money for this particular fixing the bike. She breaks free of this, and this is when her brother appears and accidentally shoots the man. Doesn't kill him, but wounds him. And this sends them on this journey with some other friends as they head out into the world. And it's really about them trying to navigate that, and her still trying to stand strong and do what needs to be. As she says in the film, right is right, and she really wants to accomplish that and to get what's owed to them in a way. And she sort of sparks this sort of I don't know, she becomes sort of a sort of rebellious icon for the teens, not only in her town but in the surrounding towns, just because of her taking a stance. And I think this is a really fascinating aspect. As they're on the run, they start getting, they start being linked to other crimes that they never did, just because people want to make them out to be the villains of the piece. And Billie Jean unwittingly becomes this icon. She doesn't really think about it, and isn't something she sets out to do. It isn't until she meets Keith Gordon's character in this house where her and her friends go to lie low and don't realise anybody's there, and then this Keith Gordon's character starts to play games, and they ultimately meet. He's the one that really inspires her. There's a moment in it, all sitting there talking, and Gene Seberg's Joan of Arc comes on from the 50s. And Billie Jean becomes obsessed with this imagery she's seeing and wants to know what this film is, and she finds out it's Joan of Arc. And she becomes, there's something that sparks in her seeing this. And there's relatability, I guess, for her, because it's like she sees herself as this sort of person who wants to right the wrongs, wants to stand up for what's right, much like Joan of Arc did. And she sort of becomes Joan of Arc in a way. It's like a retelling of that without the religious aspect and her leading an army. But there is an army in a way because of all the people who support her and want to be like Billie Jean. All the teens that she really inspires to be like her. So there is a similarity. But upon her seeing this film, this is where it sort of shifts gears for her and changes, and she becomes the thing that she really wants to be. This is a point in the film where everything changes for her, and she sets out to right as many wrongs as possible in a lot of ways. There's this imagery in this sequence that really blows me away, where she's seeing this thing and she decides to cut her hair. She appears by the pool. She's wearing the costume that you see in the film. That costume, she appears with that costume on the other side of the pool, and she's cut her hair. It's the most extraordinary imagery I think I've seen. Not only is she like strikingly beautiful in this moment, but it's also about where she becomes this person who wants to right wrongs. She becomes someone who wants to take a stand. And by cutting off her hair and being inspired by Joan of Arc, this is her moment to shine. This is really the moment where she becomes this powerful character we follow through the journey of this film. And it's such a wonderful piece of imagery that it just blows me away seeing it. What's really sad about this film is, one, like I said, it's mentioned a lot, but no one really talks about it, except for certain people on the internet and in particular film circles. And it's a film that I think should be really talked about and celebrated on so many levels. And I think the sad thing about the film, especially for Helen Slater, is she came off doing Supergirl that wasn't really well received, is bombed, is a little bit of a cult classic now, but it's sort of a film that's forgettable for a lot of people. But it's this film here and the performance that Helen Slater gives in this movie as Billie Jean that is a star-making performance and vehicle for her, this film. But because she was so tarnished by Supergirl, this film never really took off like it should have. And I just feel like this is a star-making film, and if she wasn't so weighed down by or had the stigma of Supergirl on it, she could have become a huge and a much bigger star. And I wish she did, because I think she's fantastic in this. She has this sort of quiet strength to her, the character, and that Helen Slater injects into it, and it makes her such a fascinating character to watch and a really powerful character to get behind and get connected with. And I just think that, I just wish she had a better opportunity to shine in this film and wasn't tarnished by a previous movie that she did. What I love, besides her character in this film and the message and what they're trying to convey in the film, is I love the feel of the 80s, the music, the clothing, the atmosphere, and just the way the teens act in this film I really love. I think besides Helen Slater, Christian Slater's really good in it, playing Binks, her brother, and he's a little younger, and I just really like the chemistry between the two, and you really feel that they're brother and sister. And like I've talked about Pump Up the Volume, Christian Slater would go on to do Pump Up the Volume 5 years later, really sort of become this icon and do something really great. And I feel that's his connection with this film, and that's part of the reason I think this film and Pump Up the Volume are very similar. But I'll get into Pump Up the Volume in a moment. I just want to talk a little bit more about Legend of Billie Jean. Besides Christian Slater, Peter Coyote's in it. I'm a fan of Peter Coyote. Not a lot of people know who he is. He was really big in the 80s and 90s, and he's a very unique and interesting character. He played the main sort of cop or special agent trying to catch E.T. in Spielberg's E.T., and that's probably where a lot of people would know him from, but he's done a variety of different things. But he really shines in this as this police sergeant that's trying to get Billie Jean to come in, and he's trying to make sure she's okay, and really trying to see what really transpired between her and the owner of this place, and why he got shot and stuff like that. He feels he's a character is very protective of Billie Jean, and he tries to see the good in her no matter what. And I really like that with him. He's really fun in this film. He's the moral stance. He's the adult character that Billie Jean. He's the only adult character in the film that Billie Jean seems to respect and feel like they're on the same plane. And she cares in a way what he thinks. And I kind of like that. He's like a fatherly figure to her, which really bonds them together in a way. And that's why he's really great in the film. And it's a very simple story. It's really going against the grain. It's taking a stance and really going against the system in a lot of ways, and showing youth and the struggles they go through the eyes of a character that really is the icon for them, their inspiration for them to take a stand. Like I said about Helen Slater, the Billie Jean character is strong, resilient, and she doesn't take shit from anybody. And she slowly becomes comfortable in her own skin. Not that she's not in the beginning of the film, but she really becomes so strong as she goes through this journey in the movie, and ultimately the conclusion where she really stands up to this man that's trying to take advantage of her in a really wonderful scene. She just is such a fascinating character, and that partly, I guess a small part of that comes down to the writing, but it also mostly comes down to Helen Slater's performance, who, like I mentioned, is fantastic in this movie. And this is really a star-making film, and I wish she became bigger than she actually did. And I think in a lot of ways, I guess there were some teen films out at the time in regards to this, but in many ways, I think this was a big inspiration for a lot of films that would come later, especially, like I mentioned, Pump Up the Volume, Empire Records, and movies like that really had a character trying to say something, a character taking a stand against bad people, and becoming a voice for their own generation. What I do like about Keith Gordon's character, Lloyd, he reminds me a lot of Chris Pine in Wonder Woman, in that Chris Pine isn't the main focus in Wonder Woman, it's Wonder Woman, but he supports her and stands by her. He doesn't try to be better than her, he just supports her. And that's kind of what I feel the Lloyd character is with Billie Jean. He doesn't want to control her or be the focus. He just wants to support her on her journey. And I kind of like that. That they have a male character like this that isn't trying to control her or take over. It's a character that can stand by her side, support her and help her through the things that she's going through and the journey she goes on, which I think is a really great aspect to this character. And I think Keith Gordon's really good in it. And he's really impressed by Billie Jean and can really see the person she is and wants to be. And he has his own thing where he has a rich father, and it's like he wants to take a stance against him as well. So she's still inspiring him, even though she doesn't quite see it yet. It isn't until she cuts off her hair and much later in the film that she realizes the impact that she's been having on the particular town and towns around in what she's doing. And that's no more evident in a particular scene where they're at I think they're at a shopping mall, or parked anyway, and these kids come up and ask her and these kids come up to her asking if she is Billie Jean. She says yes, and they say they need her help. Their friend's in trouble. And this is really great sequence where she goes to help this kid who has an abusive father, and she's followed by all these teens, and she goes in the house to try and help him. The father's a bit aggressive. But then he realizes who she is, and he sees all the kids outside the house just watching, and he knows that she's here to help, and he knows that he can't do anything, and he changes his tune a little bit, and allows her to take this terrified young boy out of the house and to go and stay with his grandmother. And this is a real powerful but simple moment of how what she's doing has had an impact not only on teens but younger kids as well. And she can really make a difference in this particular scene in helping this boy. She's a bit hesitant to begin with going into the house, but then she stands strong. And I think this is such a pivotal and important moment in the film. There are so many great moments besides that, and when she cuts off her hair. But I think the ending's the most powerful moment, where she finally comes back to the town, determined to expose this abusive man that she does it in such a great way. There's a beach party and she sort of blends into the crowd, and ultimately things escalate and someone gets hurt. And she really takes a stand against this guy that's been abusive towards her. She finally sees that not only is this man terrible at the way he treated her and trying to condemn her and make her out to be a villain, he's making money off her. He's got printed t-shirts and coffee mugs and hats and posters and all of these things that he's making money off this person he's condemning. And everybody's going along with it. It becomes a new fad. Everybody's dressed like her. All the girls get their hair cut short and she inspires them, but it becomes sort of a commercial thing for the guy and also for the townspeople. That when she returns to this town and confronts him and exposes him for the man he truly is, the abusive man he is, and what he expected of her in order to get the money she deserved and needed to fix her brother's bike, the townspeople really see what he's about. And she's like, no, I don't want your fucking money, and throws it at him. You know what I mean? Like, it's not about that anymore. It's not about the money. It's the principle of the situation. It's the principle of the circumstances. And all she wants to do is expose this man and get him to talk about what he really did or what he tried to do to her. And all the town turns on him. It's a really great sequence. And even like he's got this thing on the beach, this sort of pop-up thing set up with all this stuff he's making money off her with. And it catches fire and starts to burn. And he's begging people in the town to help him put it out. And they all turn their back on him, as if to say, we know who you really are. We know what you're really doing. And that is disgusting. And we're not going to help you do anything. And it's this idea of burning down all this crap he's built and put against her to show the disgusting human being he really is. And also it then ties back into Joan of Arc. There's this big statue they've made of her, and she stands there watching this thing burn amongst all the other things. And it kind of really connects to Joan of Arc. And I can see why people would say this is a retelling of Joan of Arc. It is in a lot of ways, but it's also its own thing and has its own sort of feel, and is a much more realistic portrayal of someone taking a stand or becoming the thing they need to become. And this scene is just so powerful. There's so many great and wonderful things about this movie. I want to see this movie talked about more. I want to see it sort of appear, especially in a physical aspect, so collectors can get hold of it. I really love this film so much. And like I mentioned, Helen Slater's fantastic in it. I just really connected to it. It's such a wonderful film. And it's a film I think it really needs to be re-released and appreciated, because it is such a great film to come out of the 80s. Now, like I mentioned, I feel this film inspired Pump Up the Volume, so I want to talk a little bit about Pump Up the Volume. So it came out in 1990. It was directed by Alan Malloy, who would go on to do Empire Records, which had a similar feel in a way. And this was the film that really made Christian Slater a star. He'd done Heathers and a couple of other roles. You know, obviously he was in Legend of Billie Jean, but he hadn't really taken off. But this was a star-making performance. Comes in, he plays this character that, in real life, he plays this character that moves to a new town, doesn't feel like he fits in. When he's at school, he's very quiet and reserved. But it's when he gets on his pirate radio, when he starts to express who he really is or who he really wants to be, and he becomes animated and alive. And I think this is part of the reason why I feel this was inspired by Legend of Billie Jean. The performances are so great by Christian Slater in Pump Up the Volume and Helen Slater in Legend of Billie Jean. It's about a character that dreams of other things and wants to be this person that they sort of project, but in real life they're not quite that yet. And it isn't until the experiences they have and go on shape them into who they become. They both unwittingly become the voices of their generation, not meaning to, but because of circumstances they become that. And it's also about how They're a bit fearful of how things are going, but it's about them taking a stand. It's about them saying it's okay to be young. It's okay to have these problems, but you sometimes need to stand up for who you are. And this Pump Up the Volume has the same sort of themes, and it is about, yes, it's different genders, but it is really about being a voice for the voiceless in a lot of ways, standing up for what's right. And obviously, along with Christian Slater, this is the first time we're introduced to Samantha Mathers, who becomes a great character, and kind of becomes, in a way, a similar Keith Gordon character in Billie Jean. It just feels they're copying it in a little way. And when he gets on his pirate radio station, he becomes Harry Hardon, this very vocal and creative and interesting and wild man, to the point that he is a real inspiration to the youth around him, his generation. They all listen to his program, but they also record it and they share the tapes around, and everyone becomes part of it. And it's another film where it's a character going up against a system, against a villain of sorts, with the principal of the school and what that principal is doing, and how that and the guy in Legend of Billie Jean is sort of doing the same, pointing out these people as bad people. Pointing out Billie Jean is a bad person, and she's pointing out the Harry Hardon character is a bad influence and bad person. It's kind of interesting contrast a little bit. Like, don't get me wrong, these films aren't exactly the same. It kind of reminds me what Linklater did with Dazed and Confused and its sort of spiritual sequel in Everybody Wants Some. It kind of feels like that. Not that they're both the same, a sequel to each other, but they sort of, this connecting tissue between them. When things escalate and get out of control, this is when the characters take a stand. They're fearful. In Pump Up the Volume, the Mark character jumps in a Jeep and starts recording himself travelling around the town because he's been chased after by the government. He takes a stand against the principal and the school because of what's happened. And that sort of is similar to what Billie... The Christian Slater character in the Pump Up the Volume is a guy that sort of starts out having fun, but then he has something to say. And that's kind of the similar in Billie Jean. With Billie Jean as well, she starts as a fun character, but because of something that happens, she becomes much more serious and takes on a responsibility she didn't quite expect. Both films look at the impact that someone has on people, but they don't know that. With Billie Jean, it's all the media talking about her, but also a tape that she puts out. In Pump Up the Volume, it's his voice and what he talks about that he inspires, but also has an impact on the wider world. And that's where these two connect in that regard. The character in this called Paige, that really reminds me of Liv Tyler's character, Corey, in Empire Records, that Alan would go on and direct as well. And this Paige character is the first character in the film that takes a stand, that listens to what Harry Hardon is saying and ultimately bucks against the system. And I kind of like that. It's really, this character has a real impact on the film in a lot of ways. Even though it's not a huge character in the movie, it does have its impact as well. Like I mentioned, this is star performance by Christian Slater. He's fantastic in the movie. I couldn't envision anyone else playing this role. His ability to play shy and quiet is really great, but it's also his attitude and his like damn the man way of being, and his energy and power that he has, and just his being who he is. And it really shows him as an entertaining actor, much like Helen Slater in Legend of Billie Jean. I did see an interview with Christian Slater, and he talked about how he would love to revisit Pump Up the Volume. He talked about how this was his favourite job working on this film, and his favourite he's ever done. He also talked about what a modern version of the film would look like in this podcast world. Personally, I think back in the 90s there was so much for people, especially teenagers, to rebel against. Personally, I don't think it would work. It worked in the 90s because there was so much more for teens to rebel against, and then the 90s feels like it's really cemented in that. But if you did it today, there isn't, a lot of the teens today have nothing to really talk about or nothing to fight for in a lot of ways, and they just feel like they're floating through the world. And I guess every teenager feels that way. And each generation is different and has those aspects to it. But I just feel like with a film like this, you couldn't really do it today. It just wouldn't work, especially with everybody having mobile phones, and podcasting wouldn't have the same impact. And Slater did talk about how Pump Up the Volume in the radio aspect was the early days of podcast before podcasts. But we just live in such a PG world now. I just don't know the impact a film like this would have. And would it really have the same impact or different impact, but feel the same as Pump Up the Volume from the 90s? I don't think so. Like Billie Jean, Pump Up the Volume, movies like this have a real impact on me. There's something about standing up for what's right, going against the norm, going against the system. And like I mentioned, that is no more evident, not only in these films, but especially a lot of films in the 90s. There's just something about that I connect to, whether I want inspired by them, want to be them, or I don't know, there's just something about it. And this film definitely has that, so does Legend of Billie Jean. In the end, both these films have a similar impact. They talk about similar things, and they really become, not only the characters in them, but the movies themselves, a voice for teenagers to express themselves, to examine particular things they struggle with, and to find someone to connect to feel inspired by, and allow them to take their own stands in a lot of ways. Both films might not have the exact same message, but there is a connection there for me. One inspired the other, and there are a lot of things that are similar in both. In the end, both these films have had an impact on their audience because of the stories they're telling and the themes and things that are looked at in these particular movies. Both talk about fighting for what's right. Right is right, as Billie Jean would say, and having something to say. They both have something to say that is important for their time period, and for the teenagers that were existing or were teenagers in the late 80s, early 90s. And I miss decades and years of people really fighting against things and having something to say. Not just put out videos or anything, but it just feels like it's a shift. And that all has to do with the pandemic we went through and everything that transpired. It just feels like things aren't worth doing or being part of as much as they used to be, especially in the 80s and 90s. Like I mentioned, these are both films, among others, that give a voice for the voiceless. Anyway, that's it for me. Like I mentioned, Legend of Billie Jean gets 4.5 stars from me. I think it's wonderful. Pump Up the Volume's the same. I just really want to see Legend of Billie Jean talked about more out in the world, and also in the sort of film groups that are part of it, like what I do here, what other YouTubers do. It's such a wonderful film. It blew me away. I was so impressed by it, so impressed by the message in it, and also by Helen Slater's performance and Christian Slater in Pump Up the Volume. And also Helen Slater's performance, who's absolutely wonderful in this movie. It ticks all the boxes for me, and I highly recommend it if you want a film where it's bucking the system, going against the system, having something to say, and taking a stand for things you feel need to be taken a stand for. Anyway, that's all from me today. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit subscribe down the bottom and follow me on Letterboxd and Facebook. And otherwise, until next time, enjoy the movies.